Good afternoon and welcome to our live stream today. We are going to be joined by Bill Barker as Thomas Jefferson, talking about his second inauguration as President of the United States. Let us know where you're joining from, and please leave any questions you have for Mr. Jefferson in the comments.
Oh, well, what a pleasure. Citizens, welcome again to El Monticello. I could not help but think as I was peering out the window of our north pavilion here that this day is rather chilly, very much likened unto Monday, March the 4th, 1805. That was my second inauguration as Chief Magistrate of our nation. So very cold indeed. However, do not let me take up all of the time just reflecting and reminiscing before I hear your questions. So a pleasure once more to be in your company here, and delighted to receive questions both from you and from our moderator, Mrs. Melanie Holland-Boyer. So here we are together, and if you will, I look forward to the first question of our gathering.
Mr. Jefferson, did you welcome the opportunity to stand for another 4 years as our nation's third president?
I welcome the opportunity always to stand as an honorarium on behalf of the people who place their trust and place their faith in me to uphold our Constitution and our founding principles. I will not deny that I felt there was further work to be done from that which we initiated during my first administration, the first 4 years as president, from 1801 through 1804. And so therefore, yes, as the Republican caucus met, as they referred to it, our party platform being known as, well, first the Anti-Federalist, and then the Democratic Republicans, and finally Jeffersonian Republicans, which, by the way, I've said before, I care not for any of those labels of political platform. If we are to be known by any reference, let it be the spirit of '76. But as they were referring to themselves as Republicans, they met in caucus, I believe it was the 13th of February, 1804, to decide whether I would be welcome to stand again. And so they invited me to stand again for re-election. And I was more than devoted to serve again our nation and our Constitution, the American people.
So to follow up on that a little bit, did you foresee further national business and legislation that had not yet been completed by 1804 that would need another 4 years to accomplish?
Yes, absolutely. But you know, remember, my first ascent to the office of Chief Magistrate, to the presidency, was the result of very highly vitriolic presidential election. Our nation so divided, so much turmoil politically amongst the various factions. And so therefore, being the victor finally, I had to bring our nation back together again. I had to remind ourselves of our founding principles. And you know, that does not happen overnight after people have been so angry and contentious with one and the other. So I'm very happy to know that within the first few years of my first administration, that was able to be quelled, and that our nation, the American people, were once more together moving forward on many accomplishments during those 4 years. And I think first and foremost of them, well, the acquisition of New Orleans and Louisiana, the vast territory of Louisiana, that needed to be worked out during another 4 years. Our victory, finally, in that year, 1804, in the war with the Barbary kingdoms, in particular, the Kingdom of Tripoli, known as the Barbary Wars, the war with the Barbary pirates, the Tripolitan War. Many refer to it as Jefferson's War. That finally we were victorious in that conflict, and yet we could not rest easy. There were still concerns with the kingdom of, Morocco and Algiers and Tunis. And so this required further negotiations with the ambassadors, the pashas and deys of these aforementioned kingdoms. Then also you have to remember, I had commissioned a military reconnaissance. That is how it began. I am referring, of course, to that which became known as the Corps of Discovery, led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant Clark. They were still out on their mission during that presidential election year of 1804. In fact, they had just left that previous year in 03. They had spent their winter of 03, 04 at Fort River du Bois, just about to begin their journey up the Missouri River. And so then that 1804, they were venturing farther, if you will, to make their winter quarters at Fort Mandan, the highest point above the Missouri River, as I later discovered. So we had yet to hear about their accomplishments, and most importantly, their discoveries, and whether we had made friends with the many natives that we had not encountered before. This was so very important and so much a point and foundation of my commission of that expedition, to make friends with the various indigenous peoples to the far west, that we might commence friendly commerce with them, peaceable and friendly commerce. So you might say, yes, indeed, there was much further the necessity of accomplishments for another 4 years.
Well, we have a question already from Chester, and he's asking when the U.S. switched to voting for the president and the vice president.
Well, Chester, may I tell you that was in that year 1804. That was the result of the 12th Amendment. And that was very much needed, because much of the controversy in the presidential election of 1800 were the fact that there were essentially 4 candidates. Now, some are to assume that 2 were vice presidential candidates. And that might be somewhat assumed, but no, there were actually 4 standing for that high office. Remember, President Adams was seeking a second term, and many considered that his vice presidential candidate was myself, Thomas Jefferson. But no, I will tell you, I was not standing as his vice presidential candidate, because his political platform was divided at that time by a Federalist from South Carolina, General Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. And then here, as I was in opposition to my own president, the vice president of the president with whom I was opposed, well, my platform was split. Split, if you recall, by the former Federalist from New York. I'm, of course, referring to Aaron Burr. He changed his party, he changed his coat. He became a renegade, as we say. So those 4, all 4 of us contending one with the other, all of the heresies, all of the name-calling, all of the twistifications of the facts in the newspapers, one wonders whether we'll ever see such a thing again. And so, Chester, that is why it was decided we need to be definitive about a presidential and a vice presidential candidate. And so I helped to encourage in my first administration that 12th Amendment, that the states might vote to ratify the necessity to have a presidential election and a vice presidential election. So yes, you're absolutely right. 1804 saw our first vice presidential election.
We have a couple more questions coming in here. Steve asks, what was the high point of your presidency and what was the low point?
Steve, I hardly care to reflect back as to what might have been the high point, and I say that only because history should be the judge. I would think that being able to help amend the vitriol and contention of the presidential election of 1800 might be considered a high point. Is that not the duty of any chief magistrate? I myself have written that the president must unify in himself the entire nation, to point us all in a single direction, as if we are one mind and one body. So I looked at that as a high point of my first administration. In fact, of both administrations, that I was somewhat able to mend us, bring us back to follow our founding principles. I would say the victory in the war against the Kingdom of Tripoli was a high point. This was something where we finally secured our safe commerce on the high seas, that we could enter into the Mediterranean Ocean and not worry about pirates attacking our merchant vessels, trying to extort us. That is, that we would have to pay them money to go away, to pay them tribute. So I think finally establishing a safety in our ocean-going commerce was certainly a high point. And of course, as we consider in the election year of 1804, the expansion of our nation to the west was of great concern. Well, then, that was because we certainly reached a high point in accomplishing the purchase of New Orleans. They're regaining, if you will, a free trade along the Mississippi River. In fact, a control entirely of the Mississippi River, probably the largest artery of commerce in all of North America. And of course, the addition of over 830,000 square miles to the west in that territory of Louisiana was a most remarkable accomplishment. And Steve, consider, this was all accomplished by the stroke of a pen, not by the stroke of a sword. So that was a high point. Now then, the low points. Steve, you would think that the president of our nation would have an opportunity, would have and hold a position from which he might be able to amend the continual controversies and conflicts that we face as a nation, recognizing the ownership of our fellow man enslaved. That is still so much very part of our law, even in the Constitution. And you would have thought that that might have been something I could assuage during 2 administrations. Steve, I did have the honor to sign into legislation the ending of the importation of enslaved to our nation. But Steve, you know, it did not end the commerce. And so it was, this subject continues to divide our nation as it did at that time. I would say also my concern that we do not meddle in the foreign affairs of France and England at war. The Emperor Napoleon, the scourge of Europe, the barbarian, the butcher, engaging his warfare throughout the kingdoms of Europe, that we do not engage ourselves in that, and thereby promoting as president, the whole denying of trade with those kingdoms, placing into effect, if you will, laws that would prohibit trade with those nations. No, that embargo, those embargoes, they hurt our nation. They hurt the northern states, they hurt New England more than they did the southern states that had been much more self-sufficient in the cultivation of great plantations. And so therefore I had to realize towards the end of my second administration that this had been harmful, that I was president of all of the nation, the northern states including the southern states, and therefore we had the embargo repealed. We put in its place the Non-Intercourse Act, which meant simply that we would desist from trading with England and France until one or the other desisted in their war and aggressions. Then we would be free to trade with that. And thank heavens, Senator Nathaniel Macon of North Carolina helped to initiate that Non-Intercourse Act to that degree.
Okay, so hopping around a little bit, where did your second inauguration take place, and what did you emphasize in your inaugural speech as concerns that you would be devoting attention to during your second administration?
Well, I remember distinctly my second taking the oath of office by the same individual who provided my first oath of office, our Chief Justice, John Marshall. In fact, I was John Marshall's first commission to be sworn in as Chief Magistrate of our nation. That was on March the 4th, 1801. Well, the very same. On March the 4th, 1805, I was sworn into office by Chief Justice Marshall, and in the very same place. I think what many are referring to is the old Senate chamber in the north wing of our Capitol building. Now, what was so very different March the 4th, 1805, was the fact that we had completed the south wing of the Capitol building. So the north wing and the south wing were completed by 1805. We had not yet built the connecting center portion to that, atop which there would be built a dome. No, that had not been done. However, that southern part of the Capitol building for the House of Representatives had been completed by 1805. But nonetheless, if you will, I took leave of the President's house there March the 4th, 1805, to ride horseback to my inauguration. This was somewhat different than my inauguration on March the 4th, 1801, because I was still living in a boarding house, Conrad and McMunn's boarding house, on the corner of C and New Jersey Avenue. I'll never forget, I woke up there, went down to take my breakfast at a long oval table, seated with the salt of the earth. I was there with all of the laborers who were engaged in building our nation's capital. And as I went to the door to begin to walk to the Capitol building, to that north wing then completed, a crowd greeted me right there at the door of the boarding house, and also a brass band. And so collectively we walked to my inauguration, just a few blocks there. And I'll never forget the brass band. They were made up of members of the Marine Corps. These were gentlemen who enjoyed playing in the pits, the orchestra pits of the various theaters. They would hire themselves out to do so. And so they played a new composition created amongst themselves entitled Jefferson's March. And that's how we all proceeded to my first inauguration. Well, as I said, the second inauguration I attended on horseback, this time riding from the President's house down Pennsylvania Avenue, but still accompanied by the Marine Band, or as I had come to refer to them, the President's own. And yes, they played once more Jefferson's March. They played our nation's anthem, as we all considered it at the time, Hail Columbia. And I certainly enjoy a brass band, always have, and I think they make such occasions of ceremony the more exuberant and fulfilling to everyone, particularly the young children. Now, you ask me about my inaugural address. Well, I read it once again there March the 4th, 1805, as I had read my inaugural address on March the 4th, 1801, and still many people said they could not hear me. Now, I'm not going to deny, I have not such a stentorian delivery in speechifying, as I well remember was the custom of Patrick Henry. Some say that I have a rather soft voice, that I can be generally inaudible. But there was no reason to be any the louder for it, because as I had written my inaugural address, I wrote it in order to be given to the news writers, that it might be printed in our nation's newspapers, and there the people could be the judge to read firsthand the words that I had written, the sentences and the paragraphs. I emphasized in my second inaugural address the accomplishments of my administration, the acquisition of New Orleans and Louisiana, our efforts to continue to make friends and peace with the various native tribes throughout our land, and realizing that they had not been handled with the greatest of peace and friendliness by ourselves, that they had found themselves in great turmoil throughout the last generations, that much of their land had been taken from them. And I'm not going to deny, in my second inaugural address, I emphasized the necessity of supporting them in what we consider to be improvements in their condition, improvements in the cultivation of the soil, improvements in the cultivation of their young and their livelihood, that reservations of land would be more useful to them to protect themselves from conflicts amongst their various tribes, to take the female out of the field where she was used as a drudge, so that the male, no longer necessary to go off on the hunt, could take on those external activities in the cultivation of the field, while the female could endeavor the internal activities of the household. And that, yes, I emphasized in my inaugural address. I also emphasized the cutting, if you will, of extreme expenditures in our government, ridding useless offices which cannot pay for themselves, even in the internal taxes that were rife throughout our nation. I abolished the internal taxes in preference to the monies we could make by selling land, government land, particularly the territory of Louisiana. And I'm not going to deny as well, I wrote in my inaugural address, selling the lands that we had acquired from the natives. I was complimentary of our Secretary of the Treasury, Monsieur Albert Gallatin, to cut 1/3 of our national debt. Can you imagine, when I came to office, we had a national debt of near $90 million, $90 million. And thanks to Gallatin, Secretary of the Treasury Gallatin, we cut that down 1/3. That's why during the next 4 years as president, there was further work to do to eradicate that national debt as much as we possibly could. And we did to a great degree. When President Madison took the oath of office, March the 4th, 1809, why, he witnessed a national debt then about $20 million. And through his first administration, we even had a surplus during those next 4 years. So this was something I wrote about in my second inaugural address, cutting the costs of government, allowing government not to get out of hand, to become so large that it was a machinery unto itself, forgetting its purpose, which is to protect and defend the people. And I will not deny I made comments about the vagaries and the licentiousness of the press in their attacks against my administration, against me myself, all of the vitriol that they were hurling against me, all of the misconstrued ideas that the press has a mind to how government should be conducted and how I was not serving our nation accordingly. So yes, I'm not going to deny that has always been a concern of mine, that the press may too readily think it can print misinformation, can print misfacts, can confuse the people, whereas the press ought to be the great vehicle of information for our national safety. The press ought to be the great vehicle for the dissemination of science and the improvement of our nation. So in my second inaugural address, yes, I went after the press and admonished them for printing falsehoods.
So switching gears just a little bit, Sam asked the question, and Sam wonders if you have any opinion about the proposed Erie Canal in upstate New York.
Sam, do you think it is really possible? This is what I wonder. Can we truly join the Hudson River with the Great Lakes northwards? I wonder the expenditure that this will require. Oh, I know, yes, Mr. Clinton, DeWitt Clinton. I'm not speaking about my second vice president, another New Yorker and of the same family of Clinton as DeWitt. But I just wonder whether this is going to be possible. As you know, New York can greatly benefit. All of New England can greatly benefit. I am not forgetting that part of the national concern during the presidential election of 1804 was that our farther settlement to the west, to the 100th and 1000th generation of farmers yet to come, would weaken northern industry, would weaken northern commerce. In fact, I remember there was a congressman from, New Hampshire. His name was Plummer, William Plummer. Oh, he stirred up such a controversy during that presidential election of 1804. He even suggested that now is the time to sever New England from the rest of the nation, that this purchase of New Orleans and Louisiana would be the great destruction of our national commerce. Well, thank heaven, remember, that purchase had to be ratified by our Congress entirely. And I'm not going to deny, yes, the Congress held up on, I'm talking about the Senate, held up on that. And I thought we might have to make another amendment to our Constitution to welcome it. But no, in time, those Louisiana treaties were ratified on behalf of our entire nation. Even General Hamilton was a supporter. And the reason is simple, because General Hamilton knew those farmers to the west are going to need banks. And thereby we provide that balance of these concerns in our nation between agriculture and commerce. Now, of course, I always believe agriculture should receive our first interest, with commerce as its handmaid. But rest you assured, these concerns were rife in 1804, and yes, the Erie Canal would be of great benefit to the northern states, and particularly for New York. And I will not deny the further settlement to the northwest of our nation as we proceed to do so.
Anthony asks how much you were involved in the establishment of the Library of Congress.
Oh, well, Anthony, I will tell you, I was not here during that Constitutional Convention in September of 1787 in Philadelphia. I was still in France at that time when we began to devise, the three branches of our government and their various duties, and to establish thereby in the first article the necessity of a library. And of course, naturally, I'm very much in favor of that, and would have been had I attended to that Constitutional Convention. Even more, Anthony may know, I was in favor of the replenishing of that library, the resuscitating of the library, after we were attacked the second time by the British, this, of course, and what many call simply the War of 1812. And the British finally making their way all the way up the Potomac River to lay siege to our nation's capital at Washington City. Now, by that time, I was retired from public office. That fell upon the desk of President Madison. And let us never forget his valor during that attack upon Washington. Nonetheless, the valor of his wife, Dolly Madison, saving some of the priceless portraits of our first Chief Magistrate, General Washington, and his lady, Mrs. Washington. But not only did the British burn down the president's house, as you know, they burned down our Capitol building. They destroyed that first library of our Congress. I could not let that happen without a concern, even in my retirement from public office, to seek any method we could to replenish our library. And so it was that I decided in 1815 to sell my own library, upwards then of nearly 7,000 volumes. So you might say, Anthony, that yes, I played a part in our Library of Congress in its revitalization. And yet I will tell you this, I cannot live without books, Anthony. No, I have a canine appetite for books. And so it is that I have begun a third library here at Monticello. So you must come by to visit, and I will be happy to introduce you with some of those books, many of which are copies of those I first had here, and of course many others, quite novel and new, particularly in the realms of scientific investigation.
Okay, we have a question. Two people had asked a similar question, Natalia and Maureen, and they want to know how your family felt about you being president a second time and being away from home.
Well, Natalia and Noreen, my pleasure to see you once again here in our company. Thank you for coming to visit. My family and I enjoy every opportunity that we can all be together, and that nonetheless while I was serving our nation for 8 years, 2 administrations, as Chief Magistrate. And so our family lived all together in the President's house. And I am speaking not only of my daughter, Mrs. Randolph, and her family, and my daughter, my late daughter, Mrs. Epps, and her family, but I'm speaking of our families. I'm speaking of Ursula Wormley Hughes, having come to live in the President's house. In fact, I will tell you that the very first child born in the President's house was their son. Ursula Wormley Hughes, a son. And then, of course, my daughter, Mrs. Randall, gave birth to a young boy as well, but that was after the Hughes child. And so we all lived together there. I think on the average for the 8 years, I could calculate perhaps 17 members of our families, including me, all together in the president's house. And consider this, if you will. I was allotted by Congress $25,000 per annum, $25,000 a year. Now you would think, as some have said, Mr. Jefferson, was that your salary? No, it was not a salary. That was the upkeep of the entire branch of the executive. So out of that, I had to pay my secretaries, Mr. Burrell, one of my secretaries, Mr. Coles, another of my secretaries. I had to pay for all the repasts, that is dinners, and I was not sparse on providing the finest wine that could be had. I did not sit back on providing our native victuals, but served in French recipes. No, I supported all of that. I spent thousands of dollars of that $25,000 on wine alone per year. But it also had to go to the maintenance of the president's house, the largest dwelling house in all North America. What was left from that $25,000 per annum went to the support of my families, our families living in the president's house. So you may well understand, a president will never leave the presidency any the more wealthy than he goes into it, and he ought not. Make sure that the citizens oversee that. Rest assured, this is a public service, and you are a public servant when you serve in that capacity.
So George has a question. Is there one thing you wish to accomplish as president that you weren't able to?
Yes, George. I think that you just heard me reflect upon it a moment ago as I had the honor to sign the legislation ending the importation of enslaved to our nation. I was never able during those 8 years to be of any particular success in ending the commerce of enslaving our fellow man. Our nation still continues to divide itself in that. Our Constitution, recognizing in its systems 3/5 of an individual to support the property of the only one who can vote, particularly in the South, the white male freeholder. And when I think that at the time of the elections of 1800 and 1804, that only those who could vote, predominantly in all of our states, of course in 1804, we had another state as president. I welcomed into our nation our 17th state, Ohio. But even so, in a population of, 1804, we were little more than about 5,600,000 in population. Less than 6% voted. So you may well understand that the effort to try and end this for any one individual, to end this blemish upon our founding principles, to end what the rest of the world must think is a great contradiction in our nation, and it is, was not mine to be able to accomplish. So yes, I bear a fault. History will be hard on me because of falling short in that effort.
Well, I think we have time for one more question. Do you have any advice to future presidents of our nation, should they choose to stand for a second term as president?
Keep your ear close to the ground and listen to the voice of the people. When we all gathered earlier today, I made that comment that the office of Chief Magistrate is an honorarium. It is an invitation. Someone the other day said, well, Mr. Jefferson, how did you campaign? I said, campaign? You make it sound like a particular strategy to engage battle, to do battle. No, both in my invitation to stand for president in 1796, let alone the second time to stand in 1800, and thirdly, in 1804. It was the state legislators that did the campaigning, if you wish. It was the newspapers that did campaigning, if you wish. But it is always ultimately the people who will decide. I had to make a decision as to whether I might serve for a third term. It is said that I could have easily engaged it, even despite the embargo problems. But I decided no, because I felt what had already been seen in the example of President Washington. The fact that he could have been president for life, we know that. But to know that President Washington stood on principle, stood on that idea, founding principle of the rotation in office. He did not even want to serve that second term. I had to visit Mount Vernon and try to implore him to serve for a second term, but he would not have a third term. And there, if you will, in 1796, we observed throughout our entire nation, as did the rest of the world, that Washington was a true Cincinnatus. He gave up the power of lofty office for retirement under his own vine and fig. I was the one who then set that as a precedence. I turned down the invitation for a third term. 8 years, 2 terms, I felt to be complete. It's somewhat symbolic when you think of the original arguments and debates as to how long a term for the Chief Magistrate ought to be. Initially, it was suggested 7 years. 1 term, 7 years. Until you reflect upon it biblically, it could be 7 bad years. And so I think narrowing it to 4 and suggesting that it could be open to another 4 years was wise. But as it took our Creator 7 days to create this magnificent universe, perhaps there is an 8th day that is symbolic of an honorarium to those that have served him well, to do as much good as we possibly can for the very short time on this globe. And as I have said, to allow history to be the ultimate judge. My pleasure to meet with you this day. I look forward to visiting with you again. And I thank you all and hope that you will come here often to our Monticello. I remain your humble and obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson.